The morning of August 4th, 1983 arrived in Moscow like all the other Moscow mornings of that summer. Quiet, heavy with August heat. The city still asleep beneath a pale sky, the color of old newsprint. On Kotelnicheskaya embankment, inside one of the grand Stalin-era towers that rose above the river like concrete cathedrals, apartment number 47 lay in deep silence. The curtains were drawn. The telephone sat unplugged from the wall. A single lamp burned on the desk near the window, its yellowish glow falling across stacks of papers, an ashtray clean and unused, and a reel-to-reel magnetic tape recorder. The Mayak 203, a machine that had accompanied its owner through decades of broadcasts, rehearsals, and late-night sessions with text that no one else was ever allowed to read. The man sitting before it was 70 years old, though he looked older. His hands rested on the armrests of his chair with the patient stillness of someone who has spent a lifetime controlling his body. His breathing was measured and deliberate, the way a craftsman draws breath before the final, decisive stroke of a tool. He sat for a long time without moving. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and pressed the record button. "I know," he said, "that I will die tomorrow." His voice, that voice, the one that had shaken the walls of every factory, every apartment, every trench and hospital ward across 1/6 of the world's surface, did not tremble. It was steady, low. It carried in it something that could not be described as fear and could not be described as peace. It was something between confession and verdict. He paused for a moment that stretched like a held breath, then continued to speak into the spinning reels of the Mayak 203 for 90 uninterrupted minutes. What he said during those 90 minutes would not be known to the outside world for another 31 years. The tape in the binding. In the spring of 2014, a team of workers hired to renovate a Moscow apartment began the unglamorous work of stripping wallpaper, replacing pipes, and breaking through layers of plaster laid down across multiple Soviet decades. The apartment on Kotelnicheskaya embankment had changed hands several times since its famous former resident's death. No one had thought to look too carefully at the bookshelves. The books themselves had been inventoried, cataloged, and left undisturbed. Floor-to-ceiling volumes, the careful accumulation of a man who read deeply and hid nothing. Or so everyone had assumed. One of the workers, a young man from outside the city who had taken the renovation job through a friend of a friend, was removing a row of volumes from a lower shelf when he noticed something unusual about a complete collection of Pushkin, the kind bound in dark green cloth with gold lettering that Soviet publishing houses produced in the 1950s. The spine of one volume felt wrong, thicker than it should be, heavier than paper alone could explain. He turned it over. The binding had been carefully, expertly reinforced, not with glue and cardboard as was standard, but with a thin wooden frame that created a hollow compartment behind the back cover. Inside, wrapped in a double layer of black oilcloth and then in a piece of Soviet-era thermal insulation material, was a magnetic cassette. On the cassette label, in handwriting that would later be authenticated by 3 independent graphological experts as belonging to the apartment's last famous resident, were written 7 words in Russian: "Do not open before the year 2000. The worker, whose name has not been publicly disclosed, did not immediately understand what he had found. He brought the cassette to a friend who worked in audio digitization, a man who specialized in converting old Soviet recordings for archival clients. The digitizer connected the cassette to his equipment and pressed play. What he heard made him sit without moving for a long time afterward, in the same manner that the voice's owner had sat before his own machine on the last morning of his life. The digitizer attempted, within the following weeks, to approach certain media figures and private collectors about the recording. He made the mistake of being not careful enough about who he told. Within 10 days of his first inquiry, 2 men in civilian clothes arrived at his studio. They identified themselves with documents that the digitizer later described to a single confidant as real, but from an organization that shouldn't still exist. They took the original cassette and every digital copy the digitizer had made on his studio equipment. They were polite, They did not threaten. They thanked him for his cooperation. But the digitizer had, the previous evening, call it instinct, call it ordinary human caution in a country where ordinary human caution had been burned into the national nervous system across generations, sent a compressed audio file to a personal email account through a server located outside Russia. That copy survived. That copy began, slowly and then rapidly, to move through certain circles. It arrived in the hands of researchers who could not publish what they had. It arrived in the hands of journalists who could not confirm what they were hearing. It arrived in the hands of historians who sat with it in their offices late at night and emerged in the morning looking different than they had when they went in. The file that predated the man hears where the mystery deepens past the point of easy explanation. Among the fragments of information that circulated alongside the digitized recording, one detail proved more disturbing than any other. Researchers who claimed access to partial declassified materials described the existence of a surveillance file, an intelligence dossier, opened on the subject of a certain family in Vladimir Province. The file's earliest entry was dated 1913. The subject of the file was described in its opening notation as the infant son of a woman known for her work as a choir singer in the local Orthodox church, a woman identified as having unusual vocal resonance characteristics that had attracted the attention of a researcher affiliated with the Imperial Security Services. The dossier included a photograph. In it, a young woman sits with an infant, the kind of posed studio photograph that provincial families of modest means would have saved for months to commission. The child could not have been more than a few weeks old. On the back of the photograph, in the careful handwriting of an official recorder, was written a single sentence in "The child may be of interest to the project." The year was 1913. Yuri Borisovich Levitan was born in October of 1914. Pause for a moment on that fact. Let it settle the way a stone settles through cold water slowly with the full weight of its density. The dossier was opened a full year before the subject of the dossier existed. Someone, some department, some research apparatus that operated within the vast bureaucratic machinery of Imperial Russia, and then seamlessly within the equally vast bureaucratic machinery of what replaced it, had identified a family, had identified a genetic line, had placed a marker on a child who had not yet been born and written in official language, that this child might be useful to something referred to simply as the project. What project? The photograph exists. The handwriting has been analyzed. The dates do not lie. They only refuse to explain themselves. The question that opens everything. There is a way of understanding Yuri Levitan that belongs to official history, to encyclopedias and commemorative exhibitions, and the respectful, slightly reverent tone of journalists who write about him on the anniversaries of the war's end. In that version, he's a boy from Vladimir with a remarkable voice who came to Moscow, was noticed, was trained, and became the voice of the Soviet state. The man who read the announcement of the German invasion on June 22, 1941. The man whose name Hitler reportedly placed on a list of enemies worth 250,000 Reichsmarks. The man who read the declaration of victory over Berlin's radio silence on the 9th of May, 1945. That version's true, and it is also as 90 minutes of recorded voice in a green Pushkin binding suggest, radically, deliberately, carefully incomplete. The other version begins not with a boy discovering his talent, but with a system discovering a tool. It begins not in a radio studio with a kindly instructor and an astonished audience, but in a basement, in a sealed file, and a notation written about a person who did not yet exist. It asks questions that the official version has never needed to ask, because the official version was assembled, like everything in that era, by the same hands that controlled what could be known and what had to remain, for a very specific set of reasons, permanently invisible. What was the project? Who wrote that notation in 1913, and what did they know about sound and about the human mind that receives it, that we do not know today? And why, on the morning of August 4th, 1983, did the man who had spent more than 50 years speaking only the words he was given, who had read scripts approved by committees, cleared by censors, reviewed at the highest levels of state authority, choose to sit alone before a machine and speak, for the first and only time in his professional life, entirely in his own words. He knew he was going to die. He said so himself, in that voice, on that tape, in the first sentence he ever spoke that no one had prepared for him. The question is not whether he knew. The question is how he knew, and what he chose to do with that knowledge in the 90 minutes he allowed himself to spend with the truth. The answer is hidden in the gap between a file dated 1913 and a boy born in 1914. Everything else follows from that gap. Every broadcast, every war, every secret meeting in every city whose name has been removed from the documents that describe it. Follow the gap forward through time, and you will eventually arrive at a cassette in a green binding, a sentence about death spoken into a spinning reel, and a question that the 20th century spent 70 years failing to ask out loud. Who made the voice? October is the month when Vladimir turns gray. The trees along the old merchant streets drop their leaves in long, slow showers, and the light takes on a particular quality, flat even without shadow, that makes everything seem equally distant, equally uncertain. In October of 1931, a 17-year-old boy named Yuri stood in the small courtyard of a house on a narrow side street and read a letter for the third time. It had arrived without explanation. There was no return address. The envelope bore a Moscow postmark from 5 days earlier, and the paper inside, thick, cream-colored, the kind that did not come from ordinary stationery shops, carried a single paragraph of text. The paragraph informed Yuri that there was a position available in Moscow, that his qualifications had come to the attention of certain interested parties, that he should present himself at the reception desk of the All-Union Radio Committee, building on Putinkovsky Lane no later than the 1st of November, and that upon arrival he should tell the doorman a single word. The word was written at the bottom of the letter, underlined once. The letter was not signed. At the bottom of the page, below the underlined word, were the printed characters, "Your mentor." Yuri read the letter 3 times because he did not entirely believe it, and because he understood, in the way that young people from provincial cities understand such things, that disbelief is a luxury that circumstances do not always permit. His family had modest means. He had been saving money for 2 years with the intention of going to Moscow to study acting. He had the ambition and the voice and the absolute certainty common to 17-year-olds that the city would recognize him as soon as he arrived. What he had not expected was that the city might already know he was coming. He arrived in Moscow on the 28th of October. He found a room. He spent 3 days walking the streets, eating sparingly, rehearsing speeches in front of a mirror in the cramped space of the rented corner. He shared with 2 other young men from the provinces. On the 1st of November, he dressed in his best clothes and walked to Putinkovsky Lane. The doorman who was afraid. The building on Putinkovsky Lane was not an extraordinary building by Moscow standards. It had the standard institutional severity of Soviet-era architecture: stone facade, heavy doors, a reception desk staffed by a man of late middle age who wore his uniform with the particular tightness of someone who considered it armor. When Yuri approached the desk and gave his name and stated that he was here about a position, the doorman consulted a ledger with the slow deliberateness of a man performing a ritual, found nothing, and began the standard bureaucratic response that preceded all refusals in all institutions of that period. Then Yuri said the word from the bottom of the letter. The doorman stopped. It was a small, precise stop, the kind that a person makes not when they are surprised, but when they have been waiting for something and are not entirely certain they are ready for it to arrive. He looked at Yuri for a moment with an expression that was not quite recognition and not quite fear, but occupied some quiet territory between the two. Then he picked up the internal telephone, spoke briefly in a voice too low to be heard, and replaced the receiver. He told Yuri to wait. The man who came to collect him was not introduced. He was approximately 40 years old, with the kind of unremarkable face that is extremely difficult to recall afterward, and he wore the clothing of a mid-level bureaucrat with the bearing of someone who had spent years practicing being unnoticeable. He led Yuri not to the expected offices on the upper floors where the radio programs were produced and edited, but to a smaller room on the ground level, past a corridor that required a second door to be unlocked, to a space that contained 2 chairs, a desk, and a window too high on the wall to see out of. The man sat across from Yuri and conducted an interview that was, by any conventional measure, entirely wrong. He did not ask about previous broadcasting experience. He did not ask Yuri to read from a prepared text. He did not ask about his educational background, his family's professional history, or whether he had any interest in current political events. Instead, for 40 minutes, he asked questions that belonged to no category Yuri had a name for. Whether Yuri experienced physical sensations in his chest when he heard certain musical tones, whether he had ever walked into a room and caused people to stop speaking without intending to, whether certain words, when he said them aloud in an empty space, seemed to him to produce an echo that lasted longer than the room's geometry should permit. Whether, when he was a child, animals had responded to his voice differently than they responded to the voices of people around him, Yuri answered honestly, because he had not yet learned the particular Soviet art of answering questions by performing careful misunderstanding, and because, though he could not have articulated this at the time, the questions described experiences he had genuinely had and never found an adequate language for. The man wrote everything down and told Yuri he would be contacted. The basement on Lubyanka Square, the second letter arrived in January of 1932. Its format was identical to the first. Cream paper, careful handwriting, no return address, no signature, only your mentor at the bottom. But the content had changed in one significant way. This time Yuri was not directed to the radio committee building on Putinkovsky Lane. He was directed to an address on Lubyanka Square. Anyone who lived in Moscow in that period and received a letter directing them to Lubyanka Square understood without further explanation what institution operated from that address. The headquarters of the OGPU, the state security organization that would within 2 years become the NKVD, occupied the large building that dominated the northeastern side of the square. Its reputation was not the reputation of a place where young men with unusual voices went to audition for radio positions. Its reputation was not the reputation of a place where one went voluntarily, without extensive prior consideration of what one was agreeing to. Yuri went. He was 17 years old, and he'd come to Moscow on the strength of a letter from someone called your mentor. And the alternative was to return to Vladimir and the gray October light and the life that the letter had seemed to be offering him a way out of. He was led through the building's side entrance to a basement level that smelled of concrete and electrical equipment, the particular institutional smell of a space that is technically functional but has not been designed with human comfort as a variable. The room he was brought to contained a recording apparatus of a kind he had never seen. Professional equipment, the kind used by broadcast engineers, not the amateur machinery of small radio stations. Behind it sat a man in his 40s named Schmidt, who would later be identified by researchers of the relevant period as a senior sound engineer working on classified acoustic research projects for the state security services. Beside Schmidt, in a chair against the wall, sat a man in military dress without insignia, the kind of deliberate absence of rank markings that communicates in the specific visual language of intelligence services, a seniority so significant that conventional markers of rank would be insufficient or inappropriate. Schmidt handed Yuri a text. It was not a news bulletin. It was not a speech. It was a passage of approximately 300 words that appeared on the surface to be a description of a river, the way light moved on its surface, the sound of water against stone, the smell of the bank in autumn. Yuri read it aloud. Schmidt made adjustments to his equipment. The man without insignia listened without expression. Yuri read the passage a second time. A third. On the fourth reading, Schmidt straightened slightly in his chair and made a notation on the paper in front of him. The recording was sealed. It was placed in an envelope, and according to accounts that would emerge only decades later through partial document releases, delivered directly to the personal safe of Joseph Stalin. Spectral analysis performed on audio materials recovered in the post-Soviet period would indicate the presence on that recording of a second voice, a voice that entered the register at certain points in the text and that matched, by acoustic comparison, the voice of Stalin himself to a degree of 94%. What two voices were on a recording made in a basement on Lubyanka Square in January of 1932? That question, like so many questions that arise from this story, has never been officially answered. The project that predated the revolution. To understand what Yuri walked into on Lubyanka Square, it is necessary to go back further, not just to the letter written in 1913 about a child who had not yet been born, but to the research tradition that produced the letter and the bureaucratic mind that wrote it. The Imperial Security Services, the Okhrana, which operated as the Tsar's domestic intelligence apparatus, maintained alongside its better documented surveillance operations, a small research division concerned with questions that fell outside the conventional scope of police and intelligence work. Among the questions this division pursued, drawing on the work of contemporary European researchers in acoustics, psychophysiology, and early crowd psychology, was this: whether certain qualities of the human voice could produce measurable effects on the consciousness of listeners. Not persuasion in the ordinary sense, the rhetorical persuasion of arguments and emotional appeals, but something more fundamental, something in the architecture of sound itself. The research was preliminary and largely theoretical, but it was systematic enough to produce a methodology for identifying subjects, people whose vocal characteristics from birth suggested the particular combination of resonance, tonal range, and what the researchers described as carrier frequency, that they believed was necessary for the effect they were theorizing. The methodology involved identifying family lines with documented musical gifts, particularly in the specific register of deep choral singing. It involved tracking children born into those families and noting in official files that those children should be monitored for further observation. The file opened in 1913 described the mother of the not-yet-born Yuri Levitan as exactly such a subject, a woman with documented exceptional vocal resonance who sang in a church choir and whose family history showed the kind of multi-generational musical inheritance the researchers were looking for. The notation that her child may be of interest to the project was not prophecy. It was a research protocol. When the revolution came in 1917 and the Bolsheviks took power, they did not destroy the Okhrana's archives. They read them. They found the research division's files, and they did what all intelligence services do when they inherit the unfinished work of their predecessors. They continued it with greater resources, greater urgency, and the particular ideological conviction that the scientific management of human consciousness was not only possible but politically necessary. The project, which in the documents that have partially emerged from this period is referred to simply as Golos, the Russian word for voice, passed from the Okhrana to the Cheka to the OGPU. It arrived in January of 1932 at the basement on Lubyanka Square, where a 17-year-old boy from Vladimir who had come to Moscow to become an actor stood before a recording machine and read a passage about autumn light on a river, and did not know that the sound of his voice had been expected for 19 years. What the training produced. He was accepted. He was given a position as a trainee announcer at the All-Union Radio Committee, the official, publicly legible version of what had happened to him. And he began the work of learning to broadcast in the standard manner, correcting his provincial accent, studying the technical requirements of the microphone, developing the discipline of reading text at controlled speed without the natural hesitations and inflections of ordinary speech. But in parallel, and unknown to the majority of his colleagues, he attended sessions with instructors whose names were not posted on any official roster. These sessions took place in the evenings, in rooms that were not part of the standard radio committee facilities. The instructors worked on specific aspects of his delivery, not the content of what he said, but the architecture of how he said it, the placement of emphasis, the duration of pauses, the management of breath in relation to sentence structure, the relationship between the speed of delivery and the listener's capacity for critical evaluation of what was being heard. In January of 1934, a man who was not sleeping well sat in his study late at night with the radio playing as background while he worked on a speech. This speech was to be delivered at the 17th Party Congress. The man was Joseph Stalin. The voice on the radio belonged to Yuri Levitan, who was reading the morning edition of Pravda aloud for the benefit of regional newspapers that needed the text before their morning print runs. Stalin stopped working. He listened. He picked up the telephone and called the chairman of the radio committee. He said that the voice he had just heard should read his speech to the Congress. No one told Stalin that the voice had been in training for 2 years. No one mentioned Lubyanka Square. No one referred to the project or the letter or the notation about a child written a full year before that child drew its first breath. From the outside, it looked like chance, like the right voice in the right place at the right moment, the kind of fortunate accident that makes good stories. But the man who had sat without insignia in a basement room 2 years earlier, listening to a young boy read a passage about light on water for the 4th time, had not been there by accident. And the notation from 1913 had not been written by someone who believed in accidents. The instrument had been located, collected, and prepared. It was now, in January of 1934, being handed to the man who would use it. What the man with that voice did not yet know, what he would not fully understand for another 50 years, until a dying intelligence chief showed him a folder marked Top Secret in a dacha outside Moscow, was that the instrument and the man who played it had been designed from the very beginning for each other, and that neither of them had chosen it, and that the voice that would announce the beginning of the most destructive war in human history, and then announce its end, and then announce the deaths of leaders and the births of new eras for the better part of 5 decades, had been identified in a file before its owner existed, prepared before its owner could speak, pointed like a carefully maintained instrument of unimaginable power at the future, which duly arrived on schedule, exactly as required. The 17th of December, 1934, was a cold Moscow evening, the kind of cold that settles into stone and iron and stays there until March. Inside the Kremlin, in a long reception room that had been emptied of its normal furniture and refitted with rows of straight-backed chairs, 37 people sat and waited. They were radio announcers, voice artists, trained orators, and trained singers. People selected from across the broadcasting apparatus of the Soviet state through a process whose official criteria were professional experience, vocal range, and diction. Some of them had been in the business for a decade. Some were young, newly trained, still wearing the uncertain confidence of the recently promoted. All of them had been told the same thing, that they were here to audition for a position of national significance, and that the nature of that position would become clear in due course. What none of them had been told, what only one man in the room knew with certainty, was that the selection process had already concluded. The audition was a formality. The instrument had been identified, prepared, and positioned. The 36 other people in the room were present so that the choice, when it was announced, would appear to have been made through comparison rather than through the operations of a project that had been running for more than 2 decades. At the front of the room, beside a small table on which sat a glass of water and a folder of papers, a man stood who would later be identified in certain partially declassified documents as Professor Belkin, a specialist in what was then called psychoacoustics, a field that sat at the intersection of experimental physics, auditory physiology, and early research into the mechanisms of crowd behavior and mass persuasion. Belkin had prepared the audition text himself. To a casual reader, it appeared to be a passage of patriotic prose, the kind of elevated, emotionally elevated language that Soviet official culture had developed into a distinct literary register. In fact, the text had been constructed with a precision that went far beyond literary craft. Every sentence had been engineered to contain what Belkin described in his private notes as phonetic traps, specific combinations of vowel sounds, consonant clusters, and rhythmic structures that, when delivered at certain speeds and at certain registers of the human voice, produced measurable changes in the listener's neurological state. The text was not designed to be understood, it was designed to be received. There is a difference between those two things that most people spend their entire lives without discovering. Stalin sat behind a low partition at the back of the room, invisible to the auditioners. He was accompanied by two aides and, according to accounts that surface in the margins of this story, by Professor Belkin himself, who held a small notebook and a device that resembled a pocket watch, but was in fact an instrument for measuring the subjective physiological responses. Pulse rate, respiratory change, what Belkin called attentional arrest, that Belkin had spent years correlating with the acoustic properties of individual voices. 19 of the 37 were asked to read. The other 18 were dismissed after the first few seconds, for reasons that were not explained to them and that they spent the rest of their professional lives trying to understand. When Yuri's turn came, he stood at the front of the room, took the text, and read. He read it once. There was silence in the room afterward, of the kind that silence is not usually. Not the silence of an audience waiting to respond, but the silence of an audience that is momentarily forgotten that responding is an option. Professor Belkin made a notation in his notebook and looked at the partition at the back of the room. Behind the partition, a small signal was given. The audition was over. Of the 19 who had read, only one voice resonated at the frequency Belkin had been looking for across more than 3 years of systematic research. Measurements taken during the session and referenced in technical documents of the period indicated that when Yuri read at his natural register, the fundamental frequency of his voice settled at approximately 7.8 cycles per second. This frequency, known in later scientific literature as the Schumann resonance, the naturally occurring electromagnetic frequency of the Earth's atmosphere, sits in close proximity to the alpha rhythmic range of the human brain, the range associated with relaxed wakefulness, the range in which the mind is most receptive to incoming information and least likely to deploy the critical evaluative processes that ordinarily filter, question, and resist what it is being told. The instrument, it turned out, had been calibrated by nature itself. The project had merely known where to look. The machine that modified the man. The following morning, the 18th of December, 1934, Yuri was brought to a laboratory that occupied a section of a building whose external address and institutional affiliation remain, to this day, listed in no public record. The laboratory had been assembled over several years under the direction of a researcher who appears in the documents of the period as Professor Kardashev, a man with a background in electrical engineering, acoustic physics, and what was then the emerging field of neurophysiology. The apparatus at the center of the laboratory was described by those who saw it as a cabinet roughly the size of a wardrobe, fitted with glass tubes, electrical coils, a series of adjustable copper reflectors, and a set of acoustic filters whose design drew on research being conducted simultaneously and independently in laboratories in Germany and in the United States. The machine had been built over 3 years at considerable expense and with components sourced from multiple countries through channels that did not advertise their purpose. Its function was not to amplify the voice, it was to modify it, specifically to embed within the natural voice of the person speaking through its transmitter a secondary acoustic signal, a carrier wave operating below the threshold of conscious hearing, that had been shown in Kardashev's controlled experiments to produce consistent, measurable effects in listeners. The effects as recorded in Kardashev's private research notes, documents that partially emerged through archival research conducted after the Soviet period, and that researchers have described with the careful caution of people who understand the difference between intriguing and proven, included a reduction in what the notes termed critical reasoning engagement of approximately 27%, and an increase in what the notes termed suggestibility index of approximately 34%. In plain language, people who listened to a voice processed through Kardashev's machine were less likely to question what they heard and more likely to accept and internalize it, compared to a control group listening to the same voice without processing. The machine was used with Yuri's voice through the winter of 1934 and into 1935. Then it was removed from active use. Kardashev was arrested in 1937 during the period of the Great Terror and was not seen again. The official record of his arrest lists no charge. The practical consequence of his disappearance was that the machine and the secret it represented ceased to exist in any form that could be examined, questioned, or attributed. But the 2 years of sessions had not been wasted. During those sessions, Yuri had been trained through a process of intensive practice and neurological conditioning that Kardashev described in his notes as internalization protocol to reproduce the acoustic effect of the carrier wave without the machine. The specific patterns of breath, resonance placement, tonal modulation, and rhythmic pacing that produced the effect had been mapped onto his natural voice production with the patient precision of a craftsman embedding an invisible mechanism into a familiar object. By the time Kardashev disappeared, the instrument no longer needed the machine. The machine had become the man. Kardashev knew this. He knew what he had built and what it was capable of and what it was going to be used for. In his last research notebook, a document that researchers who have examined it describe as written in the tone of a man settling an account with himself, he recorded a single observation about the ethical dimensions of his work: that the voice capable of giving people the courage to die for something they believe in and the voice capable of making them believe in something they would otherwise reject are acoustically identical. He was right. And that observation was the last contribution he made to the project that had consumed his professional life. The morning that changed everything. The 22nd of June, 1941, arrived in Moscow at 4 o'clock in the morning with the sound of German aircraft crossing the Soviet border along a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. By 6 o'clock, the radio committee building was receiving frantic calls from correspondents in Kiev, in Minsk, in cities along the western frontier that were already under bombardment. The information was confused, contradictory, and terrifying in proportion as it became clearer. Yuri was called to the studio early. He sat in the broadcast room and waited, as he had waited many times for the text to arrive. When it came, delivered by a courier from the Kremlin in a sealed packet, as Stalin's texts always were, it was brief. It told him to announce that at noon an important government announcement would be made. He read it. The city heard it. The city understood in the collective way that cities understand things before they are told that something had ended. At 12:15 he read the text that would define his life and the life of his country for the next 4 years. Attention, Moscow is speaking. Today at 4 in the morning, without any declaration of war, German armed forces attacked the borders of the Soviet Union. The streets outside the radio buildings across the country filled with people who had stopped walking to listen. Photographs taken in Moscow on that morning show crowds gathered around loudspeakers installed on building facades, on street corners, in parks. Hundreds of people standing absolutely still, faces upturned toward the sound coming from the speakers, in the specific posture of a population receiving information that reorganizes everything it has previously understood about its situation in the world. They were not simply hearing news. They were hearing news delivered by a voice whose acoustic properties had been studied, measured, modified, and trained over a period of 10 years specifically to be received in exactly this way. Absorbed rather than processed, felt rather than evaluated, internalized rather than questioned. The German military command, through its intelligence channels, became aware within weeks of the announcement that the Soviet radio voice was not incidental to Soviet resilience. Analysis of prisoner interrogations, civilian morale assessments, and intercepted communications led military analysts to a conclusion that was formally recorded in German intelligence documents, that the voice of the Soviet radio announcer was functioning as a weapon of psychological resistance more effective than conventional propaganda, because it operated below the level at which propaganda is recognized and resisted. A price was placed on the voice's owner. The figure that circulated, 250,000 Reichsmarks, was larger than the reward attached to any Soviet military commander. Hitler is reported in accounts that have never been officially confirmed and never been officially denied to have referred to Levitan as one of the most dangerous enemies of the Reich. The man who commanded the largest mechanized army in human history considered the man with the voice a strategic threat. He was not wrong. The language beneath the language, what those who designed the system had not fully anticipated, or perhaps had anticipated and had decided was an acceptable risk, which amounts to the same thing, was that the instrument they had built was also a person, and persons, unlike machines, develop relationships with the material they process, relationships that are not always authorized. Through the war years, Yuri read what he was given to read. He read announcements of victories, some of which were victories as described, and some of which were victories as required, victories shaped by political necessity into forms that the actual military situation did not entirely support. He read announcements of counteroffensives that were still being organized. He read figures of captured prisoners and destroyed equipment that belonged more to the arithmetic of morale than to the arithmetic of actual events. He understood what he was doing. He was not naive about the gap between the texts he received and the reality those texts described. And he developed over years of practice something that the people who gave him his text never detected and never measured, a system of small deviations from the mechanical delivery that the training protocol prescribed, variations in pause length that fell within the tolerance of natural speech, but that, to a listener with the ears to hear them, communicated a quality of hesitation inconsistent with the certainty of the content. Inflections that raised the terminal pitch of certain sentences by an amount too small to consciously register but large enough to introduce, at the level of felt experience rather than conscious thought, the acoustic signature of a question rather than a statement, a slight additional weight given to certain syllables in words whose surface meaning was official, but whose resonance in the Russian language carried older, darker associations. Those who noticed it, and certain people in certain places did notice it, described it afterward as the sense that Levitan's voice was telling them two things simultaneously. The official thing, clearly and with authority, and beneath it, carried in the architecture of how he said it rather than what he said. Something else, something that amounted to, the reality is harder than this. Hold on anyway. Whether this was deliberate communication or the unconscious expression of a man carrying an impossible weight is a question that cannot be answered from the available evidence. It may be that the distinction does not matter. The effect was the same either way. The voice that had been designed to reduce critical thinking had found, in the man who carried it, a use that its designers had not specified and could not control. The instrument had developed a conscience, and it had learned with the particular ingenuity of the constrained to speak it in a language that could not be arrested or censored, because no censor had been given a vocabulary for hearing it. The price of being indispensable. From the autumn of 1941, Levitan broadcast not from Moscow, but from Sverdlovsk, the industrial city in the Ural Mountains nearly 900 miles east of the capital. As the German advance made the capital itself unsafe for the person whose voice was the primary acoustic symbol of Soviet continuity and resistance, the evacuation was conducted in secrecy. The city of Moscow did not know that the voice it heard through its loudspeakers was no longer coming from the building at the center of the city. The fiction of the voice's Moscow location was maintained because the voice's Moscow location was not geographic, it was psychological. Moscow spoke through Levitan because Levitan was what Moscow speaking sounded like. The city, in that sense, traveled with him. He worked through those years with the discipline of someone who understands that the thing they are doing is the only thing between themselves and an accounting they are not prepared to face. He read victories and defeats reshaped as victories. He read the names of fallen cities in tones that transformed loss into the grammar of inevitable eventual triumph. He read casualty figures that were in the nature of war and of the state that was managing this one incomplete. He performed daily the function for which he had been selected, prepared, and trained from before his birth, the function of making the unbearable not merely bearable but meaningful. of lending to catastrophe the acoustic signature of controlled purpose. And somewhere beneath all of it, in the pauses between the sentences, in the slight additional weight on the difficult syllables, in the inflections that asked questions while the words made statements, something else continued to speak, something that had not been designed, something that was entirely his own. The project had found its instrument. But the instrument had found, in the space between its prescribed function and the full range of what it was capable of, something the project had not planned for and could not take away. The project had made a voice. The voice had made a decision. That decision would take another 40 years to fully surface. In a cassette hidden in a green Pushkin binding in a quiet apartment on a Moscow embankment on the last morning of a life that had belonged in all its public dimensions to everyone except the man who lived it. There is a particular exhaustion that belongs only to people who spend their days performing a version of themselves that is not entirely false, but is not entirely true either. It is not the exhaustion of dishonesty. That is a simpler, more correctable condition. It is the exhaustion of sustained division, of being, simultaneously and without interruption, two things that cannot be openly reconciled. It settles into the body gradually over years, until it becomes indistinguishable from the person's normal weight. By the 1970s, Yuri Levitan had been carrying that weight for 4 decades. Externally, he remained exactly what the Soviet state required him to be, the voice, the national acoustic institution, the man whose face appeared on commemorative posters, whose recordings were played at state ceremonies, whose name was attached to the cultural memory of victory and endurance in the way that certain names become inseparable from the events they narrated until it is impossible to think of the events without hearing the voice. He gave interviews. He attended official functions. He accepted the honors that were extended to him with the dignified modesty that power expects from those it has elevated, and that they, understanding the terms of their elevation, generally provide. At night he wrote, "The manuscript that was described in the fragmented accounts that circulated after the discovery of the cassette on Kotelnicheskaya embankment as running to approximately 300 pages had been assembled over more than a decade of nocturnal work, written by hand in the small, controlled script of a man who had spent 50 years managing his output with precision, on paper purchased in small quantities from different shops so that no single purchase would attract attention. He wrote in the full knowledge that what he was producing could never be published in the Soviet Union in any form. He wrote it anyway, in the way that people sometimes do things not because the doing will produce a practical result, but because the not doing has become impossible. The manuscript covered his entire professional life. It covered the letter from your mentor and the doorman at the radio committee in the basement on Lubyanka Square. It covered the sessions with Kardashev in the machine that was no longer a machine because its function had been absorbed into the man who operated through it. It covered the war years and the texts that described victories that were being organized rather than won, and the particular texture of reading words you know to be incomplete while the country receives them as complete. It covered the pauses, the meetings under the trees. Sometime in the early 1970s, the exact date, like many dates in this story, exists only in accounts that cannot be independently verified against official records. Levitan attended a gathering at a dacha outside the town of Zvenigorod, west of Moscow, in the birch forests along the Moscow River. The gathering was small, 8 or 9 people, the kind of quiet, careful assembly that the period produced among people who needed to speak honestly and understood the precise dimensions of what that need was costing them. Among those present was Andrei Sakharov, physicist, designer of weapons of inconceivable destructive power, and in this period of his life increasingly publicly and at great personal cost, a voice for the proposition that the Soviet system was accountable to the people it governed. Sakharov had by this point been stripped of his official positions, subjected to surveillance, and placed in the category of citizen that the state designates with the particular bureaucratic precision of a system that has learned to destroy people without technically harming them. Levitan sat across from Sakharov in the late afternoon light that comes through birch trees in summer, thin, moving silver gray, and they talked. What they talked about is not recoverable in its specifics. What is recoverable from the accounts that eventually circulated in the circles where such things circulate is the general territory, the relationship between the voice that speaks for power and the power that requires voices. The question of what a person owes to the people who listen to them when what they are saying is not entirely true. The specific moral weight of being useful to a system that one knows in the private hours to be producing outcomes that cannot be justified by the values the system claims to serve. Sakharov, by all accounts, was not condemning. He had designed weapons capable of ending civilization and had spent years examining what that meant about his own relationship to the state that commissioned them. He knew something about the experience of being an instrument with a conscience. They were, in that particular way, colleagues. The KGB was aware of the meeting. It was aware of all such meetings. That was the condition of existence in that period, the background radiation against which all private life was conducted. What was unusual was the response, or rather, the absence of response. The surveillance reports on Levitan's activities in this period, fragments of which have emerged through various post-Soviet archival releases, carry at a certain point a notation in handwriting that researchers familiar with the documentation of the era have identified as belonging to Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB from 1967 to 1982. The notation consists of 2 words in Russian: do not touch. The uses of a conscience. The reason for Andropov's protection of Levitan was not, as a romantic reading might prefer, an act of personal mercy or ideological sympathy. Andropov was not a man given to mercy or sympathy as operational principles. He was, by the assessment of everyone who worked with him and opposed him, an exceptionally intelligent man who understood that information is the only resource that never depreciates, and that a person with genuine access to the private thinking of the Soviet dissident community, a person who was trusted by that community because of his evident private sympathies and his public position as a figure beyond suspicion, was worth more intact than compromised. Levitan, knowingly or not, and this is one of the questions that the cassette recordings apparently addressed directly in the 90-minute final testament that the men in civilian clothes almost succeeded in erasing, was functioning simultaneously as a presence in the dissident circle and as an involuntary source of information about that circle for the intelligence service that monitored it. He was, in the language of that world, an asset. The asset designation did not require his consent. It did not require his knowledge. It required only his continued existence in the position he occupied and the continued existence of the surveillance apparatus that observed him there. The instrument had been designed and built for one purpose. Over the decades, without being redesigned or rebuilt, it had accumulated additional purposes that its designers had not specified. This is what happens to instruments that are also persons. They exceed the specification. They develop uses that the people who built them did not authorize and cannot fully control. Andropov understood this. He wrote, "Do not touch," because touching it would have destroyed something valuable. The protection was not a gift, it was a calculation. And Levitan, reading his Pushkin at night, writing his 300 pages, attending his careful meetings in the birch forests outside Zvenigorod, knew what calculation he was living inside of. He knew because a man of his intelligence in a country with his country's history could not have failed to understand. He went anyway. He wrote anyway. He met anyway, not because he had found a way out of the calculation, but because he had decided that living entirely within it was something he was no longer able to do. 2 dying men and 1 folder. The 19th of July, 1983, fell on a Tuesday. The summer was dry and warm. The birch forests outside Moscow had the particular suspended quality of late July, when the green is at its most complete, and the first intimation of gold is still weeks away, and everything is exactly what it appears to be for a moment before the year begins its turn. At a dacha outside Moscow, beside a small lake whose name does not appear in any account of what happened there, that afternoon, two men sat in the shade of a covered terrace and confronted, in the way that people near the end of their lives sometimes manage, the full weight of what they had been to each other and to the country they had served in such different and such connected ways for most of the century. Yuri Levitan was 68 years old. He had been diagnosed with a brain tumor several months earlier and had been told with the medical precision that serious illness forces on everyone, regardless of their status, that his remaining time was measured in weeks. He moved carefully and spoke less than he once had, as if conserving, for some final purpose, what remained of the great instrument that had been both his identity and his constraint. Yuri Andropov was 69 years old. He had left the position of General Secretary of the Communist Party, the most powerful position in the Soviet state, due to the kidney disease that had been killing him since the previous autumn, and he had been brought to the dacha to continue his functional existence in the way that powerful men in failing health are sometimes maintained, present, consulted, still nominally central, but receding from the world that had been organized around them. Andropov brought a folder to the terrace. Its cover bore the classification marking that in the Soviet system indicated the highest category of state secrecy, the category reserved for materials whose existence, not merely whose contents, was considered sensitive. The folder was labeled in the standard typographical format of classified Soviet documentation, with a single word and a date range. Golos, 1913, present. The Voice Project. The complete record. From the notation about a child who had not yet been born through the Okhrana Research Division and the Bolshevik inheritance of the archives, through Lubyanka Square and Kardashov's machine and the audition behind the partition in the Kremlin, through 50 years of broadcasts and surveillance reports, and the two words written in Andropov's own handwriting at the top of a file entry. Do not touch. Levitan read it. He sat with it for a long time in the July light, the lake visible through the trees, the folder open on the table in front of him. Andropov watched him read and said, "By accounts, very little." There was not much to say that the folder did not already say more precisely. At some point during the afternoon, Levitan was given, or shown, or allowed to read. The accounts differ on the mechanism. A letter. The letter had been written in emigration from an address outside Russia, and had been intercepted by the intelligence services before reaching whatever destination the sender had intended for it. The sender was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the writer who had been expelled from the Soviet Union in 1974 and whose work had done more to document the specific nature of Soviet state violence than perhaps any other literary output of the century. The letter was addressed in its salutation not to any institution or official, but to a voice, to the voice, to the man who had read the official text for 50 years, while the reality those texts described was, in its darkest passages, what Solzhenitsyn had spent his life attempting to make visible. The letter said in the passage that the accounts consistently cite, "Your lie created hope, and hope kept people alive long enough to find the truth." Whether this was absolution or accusation, Solzhenitsyn's letter did not specify. Perhaps it was neither. Perhaps it was simply the observation of a man who had looked at the same century from the other side of the same instrument and had arrived at the conclusion that the categories of guilty and innocent, of complicit and resistant, of truth and necessary untruth, could not be cleanly separated from each other in the specific conditions that the 20th century had created for the people who lived inside it. Before he left the dacha that afternoon, Levitan made a single request of Andropov. He asked that when the announcement of his death was made on Soviet radio, as such announcements were made, with the formal protocol accorded to figures of national significance, the voice that made the announcement should be his own. That the recording should be taken from the archive and played, that the last official act of the voice should be to announce its own ending in its own sound without intermediary. Andropov, who had spent 40 years studying the relationship between power and its instruments, looked at the man across the table from him, and agreed. The last 90 minutes. Between the 4th and 5th of August, 1983, in the apartment on Kotelnicheskaya Embankment, with the curtains drawn and the telephone unplugged and the single lamp burning on the desk, Yuri Levitan pressed the record button on the Mayak 203 for the last time. He spoke for 90 minutes. He spoke in the voice that had been identified in a file in 1913, trained in a basement in 1932, modified in a laboratory in 1934, and used for every purpose that a voice capable of organizing the consciousness of an entire population could be used for across more than 50 years of Soviet history. He spoke entirely in his own words, from his own memory, about his own life. Not the official life, not the commemorated life, not the life that the plaques and the posters and the respectful anniversary articles described. The other life, the letter without a signature, the doorman who was afraid, the sessions with Kardashov and the machine that became part of him, the war texts that were true in their hope and incomplete in their facts, the pauses that asked questions while the words made statements, the meetings in the birch forest, the 300 handwritten pages, the folder on a terrace beside a lake. He spoke clearly and without hesitation, and at the measured pace of a man who has decided that the last thing he says will be said well, because saying things well is the only skill he has ever fully owned, the only part of the instrument that was always genuinely his. When he finished, he rewound the tape. He removed it from the machine. He wrapped it in oilcloth and then in a piece of thermal insulation material, and placed it inside the reinforced binding of a volume of Pushkin's complete works, the dark green cloth edition with gold lettering that Soviet publishing houses had produced in the 1950s. He wrote on the cassette label in the careful handwriting that 3 experts would later authenticate the instruction to wait until the year 2000. He returned to his chair. He sat in the way he had sat at the beginning, with the patient stillness of a craftsman who has completed the final decisive stroke of a tool. The lamp burned. The tape rested in the Pushkin. He died before morning in his sleep, as he had known he would. The morning of the 6th, on the 6th of August, 1983, the radio of the Soviet Union broadcast, in its morning programming slot, an announcement. The announcement informed listeners that Yuri Borisovich Levitan, people's artist of the USSR, had died on the 4th of August at the age of 68. The voice that read the announcement was his own. It came from the archive, as Andropov had promised, a recording made years earlier, selected and edited for this specific purpose, played through the same broadcast infrastructure that had carried his voice to the same people for the entirety of their adult lives. His voice telling them he was gone, in the voice they associated with everything that was not gone, in the voice that had told them about the beginning of the worst thing and the end of the worst thing and everything in between, what the listeners heard or did not hear, in the particular architecture of that broadcast, whether there was something in the pacing, in the weight on certain syllables, that carried in the way it had always quietly carried something additional, something beneath the official surface, something that belonged to the pauses rather than the words, is not recorded. But those who sat near their radios that morning in apartments across 11 time zones and heard the voice announce its own ending have described in the accounts that find their way into the margins of this story a feeling they could not entirely account for and could not entirely explain, a feeling that was not simply grief, though it contained grief, a feeling that contained something else, the particular quality of being addressed directly and specifically by someone who was speaking only to you out of everything that could be said, the one true thing. Whether that feeling was the residue of a technology designed to produce it, or whether it was simply what happens when a voice that has accompanied an entire civilization through its worst and best hours falls silent, is a question the evidence cannot resolve. It is the question the century left open. Was he a weapon that developed a soul, an instrument that became a man who spent a lifetime being an instrument and used the final 90 minutes to reclaim the difference? The cassette exists, or existed, before the men in civilian clothes arrived at the digitizer studio. The copy exists, moving through hands that cannot publish it, and researchers who cannot confirm it, and listeners who cannot unhear it. The voice is in it, saying, in its own words, for the first and only authorized time, this is what it was, this is what I knew, this is what I could not say out loud in all the years I was speaking, except in the pauses, except in the weight on the difficult syllables, except in the small deviations from the script that fell within the tolerance of natural speech. The palate of a prosecutor would call it complicity. The palate of a survivor would call it survival. The palate of history, which is patient, and which does not, in the end, require that the categories stay clean, calls it both, simultaneously, without contradiction. A voice was designed before its owner existed. The owner arrived and lived inside the design, and found in the margins of the design, in the space between what was prescribed and what was possible, a language for the thing the design could not contain. He spoke it for 90 minutes, on the last night of his life, into a spinning reel, in an empty room with no audience except the future. The future's listening.